What if I told you that the shining knight you've seen in movies, the noble warrior riding into the sunset, the gallant savior of fair maidens, was nothing but a lie? The truth is far darker. A medieval knight's life was a nightmare of poverty, filth, and slow death wrapped in steel and propaganda. And here's the chilling part: you wouldn't survive even 24 hours in their world. Before we open the gates of this medieval hell, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you grateful for every breath in the 21st century. Knights were not born heroes. They were forged in a brutal system that chewed men alive. From the moment of their knighthood, they inherited not honor, but crushing debt. Armor, horses, weapons, servants. The cost was so immense that most knights pawned their family's treasures just to fulfill their obligations. Entire noble bloodlines collapsed not because of battlefield defeat, but because of bankruptcy. Imagine being celebrated at your knighting ceremony only to realize the title you fought for was actually a curse. The land you received came with obligations that bled you dry. Your lord demanded military service at your own expense. Your armor cost the wages of 15 years of peasant labor. Your war horse another decade. You didn't own your status, it owned you. The wealthy lords, the dukes and earls. They were the ones lending money to desperate knights, charging interest that chained men into servitude. It was medieval capitalism at its most merciless. A knight was less a warrior of glory and more a man trapped in an iron cage of financial ruin. Lose one battle, miss one harvest, and your family would starve. Yet poverty was only the beginning of their torment. The very armor meant to protect them was a coffin of steel. 60 pounds of suffocating metal clamped on your body, trapping heat until your flesh boiled inside. In summer, the temperature under the plates could soar to 120 degrees. Sweat pooled, breath turned, shallow lungs burned. Some knights died before they ever raised a sword, killed not by the enemy but by their own equipment. The Crusades turned Europe's armored warriors into walking ovens. Chroniclers describe entire formations collapsing under the desert sun, men fainting, convulsing, and never rising again. Servants poured water into the gaps of the armor, but the metal only conducted heat more fiercely, scalding flesh. Some knights tried wearing ice-soaked cloth, but in minutes it melted into steam, turning relief into torture. And what about something as simple as going to the bathroom? Hollywood never tells you this. Relieving yourself in full armor was a nightmare. To remove the plates, you needed 2 attendants and 20 minutes of clumsy fumbling. In the chaos of battle, no knight had such luxury. So yes, many went inside their armor. The stench was unbearable, the humiliation worse, but necessity crushed dignity. Castles were no relief either. Their communal latrines sat over rivers or moats, rows of wooden seats without privacy where knights relieved themselves side by side while discussing politics and strategy. Toilet paper didn't exist. Instead, rough cloths or handfuls of straw were all they had. The stench was so overwhelming that castles built separate summer and winter toilet towers, as if shifting the smell could solve the problem. Hygiene was little more than a sick joke. Knights bathed perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, believing too much washing would weaken the body. They wore the same undergarments for months, breeding lice, fleas, and infections. Perfumes and spices masked the rot only slightly, creating a nauseating blend of sweat, filth, and overpowering musk. Imagine sitting beside a knight at dinner. Your stomach would churn long before the meal began. Cleanliness in their minds was a sign of vanity, even heresy. To be filthy was proof of martial virtue and religious devotion. Knights believed dirt and stench made them stronger, closer to God, more immune to disease. They thought cleanliness weakened the spirit, and so, in their eyes, to reek of sweat and decay was not shameful, it was holy. A twisted holiness that turned the human body into a festering shrine of suffering. But filth and heat were not the only enemies of a knight. Their own tournaments, those glorious festivals of chivalry sung in legend, were little more than blood-soaked arenas. Known as melees, they resembled organized wars where dozens of knights clashed at once, trampling each other beneath horses, shattering bones, splitting skulls. The audience cheered, but often they also vomited or fainted at the sheer carnage. The death toll was staggering. At Chauvency in 1285, 60 knights died in a single day of sport. Losers were stripped of their horses, weapons, and armor. For many, defeat didn't mean embarrassment. It meant starvation for their families. So they fought until their bodies gave way, preferring death over bankruptcy. The weapons used in these contests were no harmless props. They were the same sharpened blades, warhammers, and lances meant for real battle. Even blunt weapons crushed skulls like eggshells. A knight struck unconscious would be left lying in the dirt while monks prayed over him. If he didn't wake within hours, they didn't send for a doctor, they prepared a funeral. And yet knights kept coming. Why? Because refusing to fight was worse than dying. Cowardice was social suicide. Better to be torn apart in the arena than to be remembered as a man who flinched. The pressure was relentless, a cultural noose around every knight's neck. But beyond tournaments and battlefields, knights discovered a crueler economy ransom. Killing an enemy knight was wasteful. Capturing him alive could be worth a fortune. Families would sell entire estates' livestock, even the dowries of daughters, to buy back their captured sons. It was extortion dressed up as honor. A knight's ransom was carefully calculated wealth, title, land influence. Sometimes the price of a single man rivaled the value of a whole village. Captors treated their prisoners not with cruelty, but with care, feeding them, giving them books, keeping them healthy, because a corpse was worthless, but a living hostage was gold. But this mercy was no kindness. It was psychological torment. Imagine sitting in a comfortable chamber eating well while knowing your family might go bankrupt or vanish entirely in the attempt to buy you back. Many knights spent years in this limbo, prisoners wrapped in silk chains of despair. Even kings were not immune. John the Saint of France was captured at Poitiers in 1356 and held for 4 years. His ransom was so massive it nearly bankrupted France itself, forcing new taxes that drove peasants into bloody revolt. The fate of nations hinged not on battles, but on the wallets of noble families. Families unable to pay ransoms fell into ruin. Entire bloodlines vanished, not through death in battle, but through the crushing debts of captivity. The sword might kill a man, but the ransom system could kill a dynasty. And through it all, knights still believed they served God. The church painted slaughter as holy duty. They told warriors that to kill an infidel was to secure a place in heaven. It was a deadly bargain murder wrapped in the robes of salvation, bloodshed sanctified by the ringing of church bells. But how could a man reconcile slaughter with faith? Imagine kneeling in a chapel, blood still drying on your hands, whispering prayers for forgiveness while believing God Himself had commanded your violence. Knights lived in this paradox every day. They prayed for mercy in the morning and delivered massacre by afternoon. The contradictions twisted their minds. Some knights became religious fanatics, convinced that angels spoke to them, commanding endless wars. Others broke entirely, retreating into madness, plagued by visions of demons and guilt. Medieval chroniclers describe warriors speaking to invisible saints or whipping themselves bloody to purge imagined sins. The church tried to provide absolution, indulgences, pilgrimages, rituals to wash away the stain of killing. But this only gave knights permission to slaughter more confident heaven would forgive. The cycle deepened, grinding down their sanity with every campaign. And when knighthood no longer paid through ransom or service, desperation turned them into predators. Rogue knights abandoned their oaths, transforming castles into bandit strongholds. They levied illegal tolls, plundered villages, kidnapped merchants. To peasants, these men were not protectors, but monsters in steel devouring their world. Entire regions fell into terror. Chronicles describe farmers who dared not till fields without armed guards, merchants who prayed before every road, knowing armored shadows waited at crossroads. Even lawful knights feared to travel, for lawless ones roamed like wolves in packs. One of the most infamous was Götz von Berlichingen, who declared private wars, kidnapped travelers, extorted towns, and minted his own coins. He called it honor, It was nothing more than organized crime dressed in armor. He was not unique. He was a symptom of a system unraveling. By the time of the 100 Years' War, mercenary companies of unemployed knights roamed the countryside like locusts. In the morning, they would raid French villages, and by evening they attacked English supply lines, switching sides for whoever paid more. Loyalty had become a currency, and honor nothing more than a mask. The people suffered most. A knight could rob, rape, or kill a peasant with near impunity. Who would stop a man in full armor, trained from youth to kill lords, ignored complaints because they needed knights' swords? Justice bent under the weight of fear. The church attempted to tame this chaos with the peace of God threatening excommunication for those who attacked civilians. But hunger and desperation drowned out divine threats. A starving knight in expensive armor feared debt more than damnation. And so the very system built to protect Europe became its curse. Knights were meant to be shields of society, but more often they were blades turned inward. They were both guardians and executioners, saints and sinners, symbols of nobility and emblems of corruption. Picture the dawn of battle, a line of armored men, their visors down, breathing shallowly in the suffocating air of steel helmets. The clang of swords echoes the neigh of war horses, rattles the ground. But even before the first clash, many knights were already half dead, dehydrated, overheated, and trembling with exhaustion. The weight of armor bent their backs, blistered their shoulders, and carved raw wounds into their flesh. Each step was a punishment. Each breath burned, and yet they were expected to charge with ferocity to embody courage while their own bodies betrayed them. Imagine the horror of suffocating in your own sweat, collapsing mid-charge only to be trampled by hooves and crushed beneath the armor of your comrades. Death didn't always come from an enemy's blade. Often it was delivered by the chaotic stampede of your own side. In the chaos of a melee, a knight could not hear his own heartbeat over the clashing of steel. A warhammer striking the helmet didn't always pierce, but the impact could scramble the brain, leaving men staggering, vomiting, or slipping into comas. Many lived the rest of their short lives with shattered skulls, memory loss, and madness. Medical care was primitive at best. A knight who survived with broken bones or crushed ribs often faced infection worse than the injury itself. Without antiseptics, wounds rotted. Surgeons hacked away flesh cauterized with red-hot irons and prayed the patient would not die screaming on the table. But perhaps the cruelest truth was this: to fall in battle was not always glorious. Stripped of your armor, your corpse was little more than salvage for scavengers. Enemies, and sometimes even your allies, tore weapons armor and horses from your body, leaving you naked in the mud as crows gathered above. The knight's family back home lived in constant dread. A single defeat meant not only the death of a husband or father, but the total ruin of the household. Debts piled high, ransoms arrived, or news never came at all. Widows sold everything to survive. Children starved in the shadows of castles that once promised protection. And yet the propaganda of chivalry painted these men as saviors. Poets sang of their honor. Chronicles praised their valor. Songs drowned out the smell of rot. It was one of history's most successful lies, a nightmare dressed in glory. In truth, knights were less noble warriors and more prisoners of their station, bound by armor, by debt, by faith twisted into chains. They could neither escape their duty nor live free of it. Every path led to ruin, financial collapse, violent death, or madness. So ask yourself, could you endure this life for even 24 hours? Could you march into battle knowing your armor might cook you alive? Your faith might break your mind, and your family's survival rested on whether you killed or captured another man. The answer is simple. You wouldn't last a day. Chronicles of the Crusades describe knights collapsing by the hundreds beneath the Middle Eastern sun. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, many European warriors fell not to Saladin's army, but to thirst and heat. Chroniclers tell of men dropping their swords to claw at dry earth, begging for water before dying in their steel shells. The horror was no less in Europe. During the 100 Years' War, entire companies of knights were captured not because they lacked courage, but because exhaustion dragged them down. Enemies would simply circle, wait for them to fall, and claim them as prisoners to be ransomed. In 1356, when King John II of France was taken at Poitiers, the ransom demanded was so colossal that it shattered France's economy. Taxes rose, peasants revolted, and the land bled as much from finance as from war. For one night's capture, thousands of commoners paid the price, and still knights clung to their faith. They marched with banners of the cross, believing God walked with them. Yet after battle, they knelt in chapels, confessing to priests with blood still dripping from their gauntlets. The contradiction hollowed them out, turning belief into either madness or cold indifference. Some knights broke completely. Chroniclers mention warriors who claimed to see angels guiding their swords or demons clawing at their helmets. One German knight reportedly walked barefoot across Europe, proclaiming himself chosen by God after years of battle had shattered his sanity. Others turned cynical, abandoning all pretense of honor. These men became mercenaries fighting for the highest bidder. They raided in the morning, prayed in the afternoon, and drank away their guilt by night. For them, chivalry was not a code, it was a marketing slogan hiding theft and murder. Entire bands of these free companies roamed France during truces in the 100 Years' War. Without paymasters, they lived by plundering the countryside, burning villages, and selling protection to towns. The people called them worse than the enemy. Knights, once symbols of order, had become instruments of chaos. The church tried to rein them in, launching the Peace of God movement. Priests thundered from pulpits that knights who attacked peasants would be damned. But when faced with empty purses and gnawing hunger, few knights feared hellfire. They feared debt collectors and starvation more. Thus, the nightmare of knighthood continued, chained by wealth, by armor, by a code that demanded impossible contradictions. A knight's world was not noble. It was a furnace of steel blood and lies where men destroyed themselves in the name of honor. So, once again, imagine stepping into their boots. Would you kneel at dawn, confessing your sins only to commit them again by noon? Would you risk your soul and your sanity for a system that rewarded you with poverty and decay? The truth is undeniable, you wouldn't survive 24 hours. Imagine a young knight named Guillaume. Freshly knighted, he returned home with shining armor, the pride of his village. But within a year, his family was drowning in debt. The armor had cost the equivalent of a lifetime of peasant labor, the horse another fortune. His father mortgaged their land, his mother sold her dowry, and still the debts grew. Guillaume's wife prayed each night that her husband would return alive from campaigns. But when he did return, he brought little more than wounds and empty promises of honor. The spoils of war went to his lord while his children grew thin from hunger. During one brutal summer, Guillaume collapsed under the weight of his armor in battle. He was captured, not slain, because his captor's new ransom was worth more than blood. For months he sat in a chamber well-fed, well-kept, while letters demanding gold bled his family dry back home. His wife sold their last field. His father begged neighbors for loans. When the ransom still could not be paid, his captors threatened to sell him to another lord. Guillaume wept not for his own fate, but for the ruin of those he loved. By the time his family gathered enough to release him, they were beggars. He returned home gaunt, scarred, and broken, not by battle but by the crushing knowledge that his knighthood had destroyed everyone he cared for. And yet Guillaume's story was not unique. It was the silent tragedy of countless knights. Men celebrated as heroes became curses upon their own households. Their titles were crowns of thorns, their armor coffins of debt. Many widows filled Europe's villages, women whose husbands never returned from ransom or battle. Some turned to begging at monastery gates, clutching children in rags. Others were forced into remarriage, sold like assets to cover the debts of fallen knights. Children grew up hearing of honor, but living in hunger. They watched their fathers ride away proud and shining and return crippled, maimed, or never at all. The dream of knighthood was not theirs. It was their inheritance of sorrow, and yet songs still praised knights as holy warriors. Troubadours sang of courage while peasants whispered of cruelty. The myth endured because it had to. Without the illusion of nobility, the entire system collapsed into the truth. Knights were prisoners of their own chains. So when you picture a knight in gleaming steel, do not imagine romance. Imagine Guillaume kneeling in a cold chapel begging God for forgiveness while knowing his children starved. Imagine his armor heavy, not only with steel, but with the weight of a family's ruin. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the knight was already cracking. Beneath the hymns of chivalry lay a truth so unbearable that poets covered it with fantasy. They painted knights as noble lovers and defenders of the weak, but the peasants who lived under their boots knew otherwise. To the common man, a knight was not a savior, but a shadow. His arrival meant taxes, levies, or pillage. His sword, sworn to protect the realm, often turned inward to enforce a lord's greed. Knights became the very monsters they were said to fight. The contradiction gnawed at Europe's conscience. How could men drenched in blood kneel in chapels? How could murder be called holy? Some said knights were bewitched, cursed by pride. Others whispered that no demon was needed, only human ambition and the rot of power passed down like a hereditary plague. Even death could not wash away the stain. Chronicles describe knights whose bodies, when exhumed, reeked of corruption. Their armor rusted into their bones. Priests declared it proof of divine judgment. Peasants saw it as justice, a life of brutality ending in decay. And yet the myth endured, because every society needs its heroes even if they are built from lies. Knights became symbols of a power structure desperate to survive a propaganda machine that sanctified suffering so the system could continue devouring its own children. The knight's life was not a tale of courage, but a warning carved into steel. It showed how easily ideals can be twisted, how honor becomes debt, how faith becomes violence, and how men are broken by the very roles they are forced to play. If you stepped into that world, you would not find romance. You would find poverty gnawing at every household, fear choking every breath, and blood soaking into every prayer. You would not last a day, not even an hour, before despair or death consumed you. Perhaps that is why we cling to the myth. Because the truth that knights were prisoners of a cruel system is too dark to accept. It is easier to believe in shining armor than to face the rot beneath. Easier to worship the lie than confront the nightmare. But history does not forget. The silence of peasants, the madness of warriors, the cries of widows, all remain buried beneath stone castles and dusty manuscripts. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the clatter of armor, the groans of men suffocating in steel, the whispers of a world that devoured its own protectors. So remember this: the legend of the knight is not a story of glory. It is a mirror held up to us, reflecting how power corrupts, how myths deceive, and how suffering can be painted as honor. Ask yourself, what illusions do we still worship today? And if you want more shadows pulled from history's darkest corners, like, share, and subscribe, because the truth is always more terrifying than the legend.